Greetings. Today we're going to be discussing David Ricardo, classical economist. David Ricardo was born in 1772, 4 years before the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. So you can see that Smith's work informed a lot of what he did, because as he grew up that was the dominant text in economic thought. He also died in 1823, a relatively young man, and 1823 encompasses a couple of important events. One was the Corn Laws being passed in 1815 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which became a major controversy in the history of economic thought between Malthus and Ricardo over whether or not we should have tariffs in England on imported grain. And then in 1819, as I mentioned last time, we had the event called the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester, England, which was a result of a depression and a rebellion by workers there, that many of whom were killed by the authorities during that protest. David Ricardo is often considered to be the most rigorous of the early economists. Adam Smith wrote a rather discursive kind of narrative, very insightful, but not really systematic in many ways. And none of the other early economists were really systematic either. So I think that when we think about really the beginnings of more rigorous economic theory, we usually look to David Ricardo. Some of the key topics that we're going to be covering in this discussion are the ones that Ricardo cared about the most. First was his theory of distribution of society's revenues. The second was what are the long-run trends in capitalist society, especially facing the problem of agriculture. The third is the one for which he is perhaps the most famous, which is the development of the labor theory of value, a considerable improvement over Adam Smith's back and forth over the labor theory of value. The fourth area is his theory of rent, which is actually very much connected to the long-run trends in capitalist society. And finally, his theory of comparative advantage in international trade, again a very marked improvement over the previous theories of the mercantilists and of Adam Smith, who had a theory of absolute advantage but did not deal with the question of comparative advantage. When we turn to the theory of distribution, we note that Ricardo put his focus on studying what he considered the laws that governed the distribution of society's produce. And again, this was related to the long-run trends in economic life. He also had the same kind of abstraction that Smith had, that is, the major forms of revenues that people received were wages, rents, and profits. Wages for workers, rents for landowners, and profits for capitalists. He felt that labor created all new value, and Smith, remember, had hedged on that a little bit, but Ricardo was clear on this, and he also noted that all new value is created by labor, but that old value, that is, that was embedded, for example, in machinery, reflected past labor. He also felt that wages would, of these three forms of revenues, that wages would be driven down to a subsistence level, typically, as a result of competition in the labor market. And this was a very common view. Adam Smith had a similar view, Malthus, John Stuart Mill, many others also felt that way. And despite all of these major contributions that Ricardo developed, there remain some fairly important inconsistencies in his value theory, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The Ricardian rent theory is important because of its impact on the labor theory of value, on the forecast of long-term trends in the economy, and in fact his theory of rent laid the groundwork for the later development of marginal productivity theory in the late 19th century. So in a sense, Ricardo's work in rent theory and his associated work in the labor theory of value helped lay the foundation both for Marx in his further development of the labor theory of value and for the marginal productivity theory of value, which was a critique of the original labor theory of value as well. So his rent theory is quite important. Ricardo felt that rent was a deduction from the new value that was produced in a given economy rather than as a source of value. And that's quite different from Smith, who argued that there was both an absolute rent that was related to the uniqueness of the soil and the second kind of rent that was based, differential rent that was based on the premium you get with soil that has higher fertility. So let's talk a little bit more about the actual theory. We call it the corn theory of rent and profit because we do this just with corn. We don't do it with money. We think that rent is deducted from the new value that's embodied in the corn production, the corn that's produced in the land that is more fertile than the least fertile land under cultivation. In this theory, the least fertile land would yield no rent at all, we call this the no rent land. And so the idea is if you line up all of the parcels of land according to their fertility, the one that is under cultivation but has the lowest fertility would not receive any rent. The more fertile land would receive a rent payment. And here's the stylized history of agriculture in Ricardo. We begin with the notion that only the most fertile land is cultivated. After all, if there's no demand for food, that would require less fertile land to be brought into cultivation, then it wouldn't be. Initially, if only for the most fertile land is cultivated, it generates no rent. It's the no rent land. But then as population growth continues and there's an increasing demand and requirement really for food, then land of less fertility and thus lower productivity, less corn produced per unit of land, is brought into cultivation to meet the population's need for food. So now the newly cultivated, less fertile land becomes the no-rent land, and the originally cultivated, more fertile land generates rent as a result of market competition among capitalist farmers. You can imagine a scenario where a capitalist farmer employs a fixed combination of labor and capital. We call that a dose of labor capital, and applies that dose of labor capital to the most fertile land. Then all the most fertile land has been used up as the population grows, and now there's a greater demand for food that requires more food to be grown in the less fertile land. So now there's a capitalist farmer who is cultivating the less fertile land, and interestingly here the output from the application of a dose of labor capital is going to be less than that in the more fertile land. So that if perhaps an acre gives 100 bushels of corn in the most fertile land, only 80 bushels of corn in the less fertile land, that capitalist farmer is going to be very unhappy because their profit will be less than that of the other. So they may go to the landlord who owns the most fertile land and say, listen, I'll make you a deal. Currently, you're not getting any rent, but now I'd like to get into that land, and I'll offer you some rent. If I have 20 extra bushels that I could make if I were on your land, I'd give you half of that. And the landlord says, oh, that's interesting. Well, maybe I'll go talk to the other guy who's currently there and see what he says. Well, so you get a sense that the market competition among capitalist farmers to be able to cultivate the most fertile land leads to the generation, the bidding away, you might say, of the profit that they otherwise would have gotten to the landlord. Now, in the example in your textbook, we have 3 levels of fertility. we have 100 bushels, 90 bushels, and 80 bushels with these equal doses of a unit of combined capital labor. And we say that's perhaps a plow and a worker. And the landowners don't do anything except own the land, and the capitalist farmers rent the land from the landowners. And so if only the most fertile land is used, then the 100 bushels are split between the capitalist farmer and the worker. Now, the worker has to get his or her subsistence, and so that will say is 60 bushels of corn, and the capitalist receives 40 bushels in profit, and there is no rent. That's if we have the 100 bushels in the most fertile land. But as I said earlier, we have the growing population needing more food, and so the next most fertile parcels are brought into cultivation. 90 bushels of corn are all that are produced on this land of less fertility instead of 100. But the worker still has to receive subsistence, right? Because otherwise he or she will die. It's a little graphic, but that's the point. And so the capitalist would only receive 30 bushels in profit, and there is no rent on this parcel of less fertile land. But we no longer get equal returns to the capitalists for their investments in farming. And of course we know there is a tendency towards equal returns from investment across the economy. So the capitalists who rented the less fertile land received 10 bushels fewer initially than those who rented the most fertile land. The capitalists on the less fertile land offer to pay rent to the landowners of the more fertile land. They want the landlords to actually evict the current renters so they can replace them and improve their profit over what they were getting on the less fertile land. So maybe they offer 5 bushels of rent. I said 10 bushels earlier, but let's just say 5. And if that worked, they would now have 35 bushels of profit instead of 30. But the current renters would compete for the better land they currently occupy by offering 6 bushels. After all, the landlord is willing to conduct an auction to see who will offer the most rent for the most fertile land. And so this bidding war would continue until the 10 bushel differential is entirely bid away to the landlord. So therefore, under Ricardo's scheme, rent, which remember is a deduction from the production of current and previous labor, rent is based on the differential fertility of the soil alone in his model. Now, we can extend this to a monetized economy with 2 sectors, corn and manufactured goods. And to do this properly, we have to look at the labor theory of value. And we are going to be taking this up in our next video. We're going to talk about the Ricardian labor theory of value, labor heterogeneity, and recalling the deer and beaver example of Adam Smith to start with. Thank you.